November crept in like an unwelcome chill, the last brown leaves swirling in the wind and skies thick with early darkness. It was the sort of month where the world felt a little emptier, a little too quiet, as if it were holding its breath for something to come. And in one small, otherwise quiet town, it did. It began with an old man named Harold Massey, who'd been a fixture in the town for decades, the kind of person everyone knew by face, if not by name. He lived alone in a sagging farmhouse just off a winding road at the town's edge. People usually saw him during his morning walks, a stooped figure shuffling past cracked sidewalks with a look of vague irritation at everything around him. So, when he stopped appearing, no one thought much of it, until a few weeks passed, and the postman reported a strange smell coming from the house. When the police arrived, they found Harold Massey's door slightly open, which was odd. The lights were all off, despite the town already blanketed in early darkness. The officers called out his name, but silence answered, save for the faint ticking of an old clock somewhere in the depths of the house. The smell grew stronger as they moved through the empty rooms, finally reaching the living room, where they found Harold seated in his favorite chair by the window. He looked fine. Not decomposed as they might have expected, but somehow wrong. His eyes stared forward, unseeing, and his skin had an odd gray pallor that made one of the officers shiver. As the officers moved closer, they saw that his mouth was open, his lips pulled back in what could have been a smile or maybe a scream. No signs of struggle, no blood, nothing that suggested foul play. But as they turned to leave, one of them noticed a dark stain on the floor beneath his chair, a sticky pool that looked like dried blood. They found the cause. His feet were badly scratched and raw, as if he had tried to dig his heels into the ground. Yet the floor was solid. There was nothing for him to have clawed at. The autopsy was inconclusive. The coroner, a woman with 20 years in the job, came out of the room pale and refused to discuss what she'd seen. All she said was that there was no logical explanation. He had simply died. The funeral was arranged quickly, attended by a few distant relatives, and life went on. But just as November reached its coldest, that house did not go back to silence. One night, a local teenager, Evan, dared his friends to break into Harold's house. A bit of thrill-seeking seemed perfect, especially in that creaky old place everyone now whispered was haunted. He and his friends, Sarah and Mark, snuck in through the kitchen window, phones out, hoping to catch something creepy. They wandered through the house, laughing and poking fun at the creepy decor, when Sarah shushed them, pointing down the hall toward Harold's chair in the living room. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but they heard it. A soft scratching, a sound that seemed to come from below, like nails clawing at wood. They moved closer, stopping in the doorway, heartbeats hammering. And there it was, Harold's chair, empty and dark, creaking faintly as if someone had just shifted their weight in it. The scratching grew louder. It was coming from the floor beneath them, that's growing frantic. Mark shined his flashlight down, and they saw it. The floorboards under the chair looked scratched, almost worn through, claw marks gouging deep into the wood. As they stared, a low groan echoed through the house, the kind of sound that chills the blood. They turned to leave, but the door at the end of the hall slammed shut, sending them into a panic. Sarah tried the front door, but it wouldn't budge. Evan and Mark tried the window they'd come through. It was locked. They were trapped. Then they heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, coming from Harold's chair. The three of them froze, ears straining to make sense of it. It was a single word, repeated over and over in a scratchy, grating voice that seemed to echo through the air. Help! The voice faded, and the scratching beneath the floor grew more violent, as if something was desperate to escape. The scratching stopped suddenly, plunging the house into an unnatural silence. Then the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps came from upstairs, heavy and dragging, like someone pulling themselves forward. Each step brought it closer to the stairs, closer to them. Mark took a step back, trembling, his phone flashlight shaking in his hand. "We need to go," he whispered, but none of them moved, their eyes fixed on the shadows at the top of the stairs. They could barely make out a shape, a figure slowly descending, its outline wrong, twisted, like a person forced into an unnatural shape. It reached the bottom step, and then they saw its face, illuminated for a brief moment in the flicker of the flashlight. It was Harold, or something wearing his face, a ghastly mask pulled too tight, eyes blank and staring, mouth twisted into that same awful grimace. In that moment, the front door flew open with a violent crash, and they didn't hesitate. They ran, bursting out into the cold November night, not stopping until they were blocks away, lungs burning with fear. They didn't talk about it afterward, and no one dared return to Harold Massey's house. A few days later, the house was mysteriously boarded up. The town never found anyone responsible, and the rumors about Harold Massey and his cursed home faded over time. But every November, as the days grew short and the nights long, some swore they saw an old man shuffling past the edge of town, his eyes dark, his mouth twisted in that same grimace. If anyone was brave enough to look closer, they might notice his feet, scratched and raw, as if he had been clawing his way up from somewhere very dark. There was a small, forested area on the outskirts of a town called Black Hollow. People avoided it at night because, for as long as anyone could remember, the woods were known to play tricks on those who dared to enter. Voices would echo from nowhere, strange lights would drift through the trees, and people who wandered in reported losing hours or feeling like they were being watched. But one particular night in November, 3 friends discovered something worse than any legend. Cody, Mia, and Dylan were high school seniors looking for a thrill on their last night before the holiday break. Despite warnings from locals, they decided to camp overnight in the woods. They brought flashlights, snacks, and a few stories to spook each other. Laughing as they walked, they felt untouchable. After all, it was just a bunch of trees. They set up camp by a large, twisted tree that locals called the Witch's Spine. The tree had long been part of town legend, rumored to have been the site of something terrible many years ago. The story went that a woman accused of witchcraft was buried there alive, and her spirit cursed the land around her grave. But the 3 friends shrugged it off as nonsense and huddled around a small fire, taking turns sharing ghost stories to pass the time. As they laughed and told stories, Cody noticed something strange about the tree. It looked like the bark was shifting, the twisted patterns on its surface moving in the flickering firelight. The lines seemed to form a face, a woman's face, pale and gaunt with hollow, staring eyes. He blinked, and it was gone. He laughed it off, blaming it on the firelight and his own nerves. But just as he was about to mention it, Mia spoke up. "Did you guys hear that?" she whispered, her voice tight. They fell silent, straining to hear. The wind had picked up, rustling the branches overhead, but there was something else beneath it, a soft, scraping sound, like fingernails dragged across wood. It was coming from the tree. Dylan smirked, assuming it was an animal, and went over to investigate, but as he got closer, the scratching stopped. "Probably a squirrel," he said, turning back to the group, but he didn't look convinced. The night deepened, and an unsettling cold set in. The fire flickered, and Mia noticed that their shadows seemed to be moving in strange ways, stretching and twisting, as if something invisible was lurking just beyond the light. At one point, she thought she saw a figure out of the corner of her eye, standing by the tree. But when she looked, there was nothing there. They decided to pack up and leave, but as they turned away from the fire, they all froze. In the faint glow of their flashlights, the face that Cody had seen earlier appeared again on the tree, clearer this time. Its eyes were empty, but its mouth was twisted into a silent scream. None of them could move. It was as if the face held them in place, its hollow eyes staring into each of theirs. Then they heard it, a whisper that seemed to come from the ground beneath their feet. "Help me," it rasped, the voice raw and broken, like something that had been buried for a long, long time. A cold wind swept through the woods, extinguishing their fire and plunging them into darkness. Panic surged, and they ran, but the woods seemed to close in around them. Their flashlights barely pierced the darkness, the trees looming closer and closer, as if they were moving. The whispers grew louder, joined by others, voices overlapping, rising into a chorus of desperate cries. Cody's heart pounded as he realized the voices weren't just random. Each one was calling their names. "Don't look back," Mia gasped, her voice barely audible over the whispering voices. But she couldn't help herself, glancing over her shoulder. She stifled a scream when she saw them. 3 dark figures standing in the shadows, each one looking exactly like them, wearing their clothes, their faces twisted into that same expression of terror and despair. Then They ran faster, stumbling and clawing through the undergrowth until they broke free of the forest and it's collapsing on the ground under the cold November sky. They looked back, and in the distance, just beyond the edge of the trees, they saw the twisted shapes of their own reflections, watching them silently before fading into the shadows. The three friends never spoke of that night again, but none of them ever set foot near those woods. And every November, when the winds grew cold and the nights stretched long, they each swore they could hear faint whispers calling their names from the forest's edge, inviting them to come back just one more time. It wasn't until years later that they learned the full story. A family had once lived near the witch's spine, a mother, father, and 3 children. They vanished one November night long ago, their voices said to echo through the woods, waiting for someone to help them find their way out. And on cold November nights, if you listen carefully at the edge of Black Hollow, you can still hear them. In a quiet town near the coast, there was a house known simply as the Flood House. It sat at the end of an abandoned street, rotting and water-stained, even though it hadn't rained heavily in years. Most people avoided it, but for as long as anyone could remember, people swore they heard dripping sounds coming from inside, even during droughts. They claimed that the house held a curse from something that had happened a century ago, a tragedy that no one remembered in detail, but everyone somehow knew. Every November, a rumor would circulate through the town that if you dared to enter the flood house after dark, you'd find yourself in a nightmare from which you might never return. Most people ignored it, brushing it off as just another urban legend. But there were always a few who couldn't resist the challenge. One dark November night, 4 college friends, Emma, Tyler, Jake, and Lena, decided to explore the flood house. They were skeptics, thrill-seekers who dismissed the town's superstitions. Armed with flashlights, they climbed over the rusted gate and stepped onto the cracked path leading to the house. The air was strangely damp, and there was a faint, stale smell, as if the ocean had seeped into the walls. The moment they entered the house, they felt a heavy silence settle over them. It was the kind of silence that pressed in from all sides, filling every corner with something unspoken, something watching. Their flashlights illuminated peeling wallpaper, rotting wood, and the faint outline of water stains stretching from floor to ceiling. A dripping sound echoed through the empty rooms, even though there was no visible water source. They wandered through the first floor, examining old, ruined furniture and broken picture frames. Then they heard it, a faint, rhythmic splash, like someone walking through shallow water. The sound came from the basement door, which was slightly ajar. Without speaking, they made their way down the creaky, sagging staircase into the darkness below. The basement was flooded ankle-deep with dark, brackish water that gleamed in the glow of their flashlights. The air was thick with a smell that was damp, metallic, and old, like rusted iron and salt. And as they stepped further in, they felt the water ripple, as if something unseen was moving just beneath the surface. Lena gasped and pointed. In the far corner, a shape rose slowly from the water, a figure barely visible in the shadows, its form twisted and dark, almost like it was part of the water itself. The others stared, unable to believe what they were seeing. Then it moved, a slow, jerking motion, dragging itself through the water toward them. Panic set in, and they turned to run back up the stairs, but the basement door slammed shut. They pounded on it, screaming, but their voices were swallowed by the thick, damp silence. The dripping sounds grew louder, now echoing all around them, coming from the walls, the ceiling, even the floor. It was as if the house itself was alive, watching them, waiting. The figure continued to crawl toward them, its form shifting and merging with the water as if it were made of liquid darkness. It left a trail of thick black sludge in its wake, and as it drew closer, they saw it more clearly. It had no face, only hollow indentations where eyes should have been, and a mouth that stretched too wide, dripping water that seemed to turn to blood as it hit the ground. Tyler tried the door again, throwing himself against it, but it wouldn't budge. The water around them began to rise, inching up to their knees, then their waists. Their flashlights flickered, and the figure vanished into the darkness, only to reappear closer, its arms reaching out, its fingers elongated and clawed, dripping with black water. Emma screamed, the sound echoing through the basement as cold, slimy hands brushed her ankle. She kicked and stumbled backward, her flashlight slipping from her grip and falling into the water. It illuminated the floor for a moment, revealing faces beneath the surface. Pale, contorted faces with wide, empty eyes staring up at them, mouths open in silent screams. The water was filled with them, a sea of ghostly faces that seemed to be writhing just beneath their feet. The door finally creaked open and they scrambled up the stairs, slipping and stumbling as the water chased after them, spilling over the steps. They burst out of the basement, drenched and gasping for air, and sprinted through the house toward the front door. But as they reached it, they saw it was covered in water stains, pulsing as if alive. The door wouldn't open. Jake turned, pointing his flashlight back down the hallway, and froze. The entire house was filling with water, black and thick, rising up the walls and dripping from the ceiling. The faces they'd seen in the basement were now peering out of the walls, stretching the wallpaper like skin. A chorus of voices filled the air, crying out in agony, begging for help, for mercy. The friends huddled together, desperately trying to break a window, but the glass wouldn't budge, almost as if it had been fused to the frame. The water continued to rise, lapping at their ankles and their knees, rising far faster than it should have. Then a voice, clearer than the others, spoke from the shadows, its tone cold and distant. "We're waiting," it whispered. "We've waited for so long. Join us." The water rose to their chests, and they could feel hands reaching up from beneath the surface, grasping at their legs, pulling them down. They struggled, but it was useless. The hands were relentless, dragging them deeper into the cold, black water, as the walls seemed to close in, the faces grinning in the darkness. As the water reached their mouths, silencing their screams, they saw the figure from the basement standing over them, watching with empty eyes. It reached out, and the last thing they saw was its hands stretching toward them, pulling them down into the darkness. The next morning, the townspeople noticed water seeping out from beneath the flood house's front door, a dark, brackish puddle pooling on the cracked porch. Inside, the house was empty as it had been for decades. But if anyone dared to venture close enough, they could hear faint, muffled voices from within, echoing softly, begging for help, and the sound of water dripping endlessly as if from somewhere very deep. No one ever saw Emma, Tyler, Jake, or Lena again. But sometimes, on cold November nights, people passing by swear they see faces in the windows, faces staring out, mouths open as if trying to scream. And if they listen closely, they can hear the soft, rhythmic dripping of water like a heartbeat coming from deep within the walls. The town of Clearfield had a legend, whispered mostly by older residents and never repeated after dark. In the late 1800s, a man named Samuel Harker had moved to the town to build his dream home on a stretch of open land near the river. The house, a grand Victorian mansion, was the largest for miles, with stained glass windows and intricate woodwork on every wall. But Samuel Harker never got to live there. Shortly after construction was complete, he was found dead in the dining room, sitting at the head of a long table, eyes wide open in terror. They said his face had been twisted into a horrible expression, as if he'd seen something unspeakable just before he died. After his death, the house went dark. Families who tried to move in left within weeks, speaking of strange noises, cold drafts, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. People eventually called it Harker House and stayed far away. The house sat empty for over a century, crumbling with age, until one cold November when a young couple named Alex and Marie bought it on a whim, looking for a quiet place to start fresh. When they moved in, the house seemed welcoming enough, if a bit shabby and worn. They spent the first day cleaning and unpacking, finding it charming, like an old, forgotten relic waiting to be restored. But on their first night, something felt off. The house was cold, colder than it should have been even in November, and every sound seemed to echo twice as loudly in the empty halls. Alex laughed it off, saying the house just needed a bit of life to wake it up. Marie smiled, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease, especially as the shadows grew longer. She caught herself looking over her shoulder, convinced she was being watched. Just after midnight, as they settled into bed, they heard a low creaking sound coming from downstairs. They froze, listening. It was rhythmic, like the sound of someone slowly pacing in the dining room. Alex brushed it off as the house settling, but the sound continued, growing louder, closer, moving up the stairs. Unable to ignore it any longer, Alex grabbed a flashlight and went to check. He found nothing but empty rooms and silent, dark hallways. But when he returned to their bedroom, Marie pointed out something chilling. His feet were covered in dirt, leaving muddy prints across the floor. The strange part? He hadn't gone outside, and they'd swept the entire house earlier. The next day, they noticed small, unsettling changes. The doors they'd closed would be open, the lights they'd turned off would be on, and Marie swore she'd hear faint, raspy whispers in empty rooms. When she tried to listen closely, they'd stop. She wanted to leave, but Alex assured her it was just an adjustment period. They were letting their imaginations get the best of them. But that night, things escalated. Around 3 a.m., they both woke to the sound of footsteps pacing outside their bedroom door. The same slow, deliberate creak that had started downstairs the night before. Alex whispered for her to stay quiet, and they listened, holding their breath as the footsteps approached their door and then stopped. They waited, barely daring to breathe. The silence stretched thick and tense until the doorknob slowly turned, creaking as if it hadn't been used in years. The door didn't open all the way, just a crack, enough for them to see a sliver of the hallway beyond. There was nothing there, no one standing in the hall, just darkness. But they could feel something, a presence, something heavy and cold, standing just out of sight. Suddenly, a low voice echoed from the hallway, whispering in a raspy, almost broken tone, "It's time." Terrified, they huddled together, not daring to move. But the voice grew louder, repeating the phrase, "It's time," until it was almost a chant. Then, just as abruptly as it had started, it stopped, leaving the house in complete silence once again. The next morning, they decided to leave. They packed hastily, throwing belongings into suitcases without caring if they left anything behind. But as they made their way down the stairs, they noticed something chilling. A large, dusty mirror in the front hall now had a message scrawled across it in what looked like smudged, dark fingerprints. The message read, "Do not leave." Alex and Marie stared at the words, fear twisting in their stomachs. Without another word, they turned to run out the front door. But as they reached it, a loud bang echoed from behind them, and the front door slammed shut on its own. Marie grabbed the knob, but it wouldn't turn. They were trapped. They backed away, feeling the cold seep in around them, the shadows seeming to stretch and reach toward them. The house was no longer silent. A low, whispering murmur filled the air, voices overlapping, rising and falling in a discordant hum. They could make out fragments, words like stay, forever, ours. The dining room door creaked open, and they saw a figure seated at the head of the table, where Samuel Harker had been found dead a century before. The figure was gaunt and hollow-eyed, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, its face twisted into that same frozen look of horror. But the worst part was its eyes. They were moving, darting back and forth as if the figure were alive, watching them, tracking their every movement. Paralyzed with fear, Alex and Marie stared, unable to look away. The figure slowly lifted its hand and pointed to 2 chairs at the table, chairs that had been empty when they'd entered. But now, they were occupied by shadowy forms, barely visible in the dim light. And as they looked closer, Alex and Marie realized that the figures seated in the chairs looked just like them. The voices grew louder, filling the room, chanting, "Stay, stay, stay!" The shadowy figures at the table turned their heads slowly, fixing empty, dark eyes on Alex and Marie, mouths opening in silent screams. In a panic, they ran back up the stairs, desperate to find any way out. But as they reached the second floor, they found themselves back in the front hall, as if the house itself had shifted around them. They tried again and again, only to be brought back to the same spot, facing the mirror with the message scrawled across it, "Do not leave." Trapped in an endless loop, Alex and Marie's screams were swallowed by the house, joining the echo of voices that would haunt Harker House for eternity. And by morning, the house was silent once more, waiting for the next unsuspecting souls to cross its threshold. Some say you can still see them, if you dare to look into the house's windows on a dark November night. Figures moving slowly, repeating the same footsteps, pacing in circles that never end. And if you listen closely, you might hear them whispering for help, or calling you to join them. In a small, fog-covered town called Ashgrove, there was a legend about an old bridge deep in the woods. The locals called it the Whisper Bridge. It was a rotting, sagging structure that spanned a narrow, murky creek, barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. People avoided it because the bridge was rumored to call to those who passed by, drawing them in with strange, unearthly voices that echoed from beneath it. They said anyone who lingered too long would never return. It was one of those cold, still nights in November when 4 friends, Rachel, James, Ben, and Clara, decided to investigate the bridge. They were in their senior year of high school and wanted one last thrill before everyone scattered after graduation. They'd heard the stories all their lives, but brushed them off as a spooky bedtime story. Despite the warnings, they laughed as they made their way through the woods, flashlights in hand, kicking up leaves and joking about the so-called curse. When they reached the bridge, it looked older and more decrepit than they'd imagined. Thick vines twisted around the railing and the wood was damp and rotting. The fog hung low over the creek, thick and silent, giving everything a ghostly glow. The air felt heavy, pressing down on them as they stepped onto the bridge. Rachel was the first to notice it, the soft, barely audible sound of whispering. She shivered, glancing around, but there was no one there. The others felt it too, an almost magnetic pull toward the center of the bridge, as if something was drawing them closer. "Do you hear that?" Clara whispered, her voice barely carrying over the eerie quiet. They all nodded, faces pale in the flashlight's glow. The whispers were coming from below, from the water, faint but unmistakable. As they leaned over the edge of the bridge, the fog parted slightly, revealing something dark and shifting just beneath the surface. Rachel squinted, trying to make out the shape. It looked like a face with hollow eyes, staring up at her with a look of agony. She stumbled back, heart racing, but as she did, the whispering grew louder, now sounding like a chorus of voices, all overlapping, each one desperate and pleading. "Help us! Come closer! Join us!" James tried to pull her away, but she felt rooted in place, compelled to look again. The water was rippling, the face multiplying, dozens of pale, ghostly faces staring up from the depths, mouths moving silently, begging, pleading. She could make out words now, whispered in fragments, voices that sounded cracked and broken as if they hadn't spoken in years. Stay. Forever. Don't leave. Rachel wanted to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. She reached for James, her fingers ice cold, and whispered, "We need to leave. Now." But as they turned to go, a sharp crack echoed through the night. The old wood gave way beneath their feet, and the bridge lurched, sending them sprawling. The flashlights tumbled out of their hands and skittered across the bridge, casting strange, twisting shadows on the fog. The whispering grew louder, almost frantic now, as if whatever was beneath the bridge sensed its chance. Ben scrambled to his feet, trying to grab Clara, but her eyes were wide, staring into the water as if in a trance. "Clara, come on!" he shouted, shaking her, but she didn't move, her gaze locked on the creek. Then, with a terrible, eerie grace, she stepped off the edge of the bridge and vanished into the water. The others screamed, reaching for her, but it was too late. Clara's figure disappeared beneath the surface, her hand slipping out of Rachel's grasp just as she tried to pull her back. For a moment, everything went still. Then the water erupted with movement, a writhing mass of shadows and pale, clawing hands that dragged her down, pulling her deeper and deeper until she was gone. Panicked, the 3 remaining friends scrambled off the bridge, stumbling back into the woods. They ran, branches whipping at their faces, the whispers still echoing behind them, following them through the trees, calling their names in soft, mournful tones. They didn't stop until they reached the edge of the woods, collapsing onto the ground, gasping for breath. But as they looked back, they saw something chilling. There at the edge of the trees was Clara, standing perfectly still, watching them. Her skin was pale and waterlogged, her eyes wide and empty, her mouth twisted into an eerie, unnatural smile. "Come back," she whispered, her voice carrying through the fog. "It's so peaceful here." Terrified, they backed away, watching as Clara faded into the mist, her form dissolving until there was nothing left. They fled, vowing never to return to the woods, never to speak of that night again. But they were haunted by Clara's final words, by the strange, unearthly peace they'd seen on her face. And every November, as the nights grew cold and the fog settled over Ashgrove, each of them heard it, the faint, familiar whispering calling to them from the woods, begging them to come back. Some nights they even saw her in their dreams, her face pale and cold, her eyes hollow, reaching out a hand, smiling that same strange, twisted smile as she whispered, "It's so peaceful here." In the quiet town of Alder Grove, nestled deep in the woods, there was an old legend about an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts called the Weller Place. The house had stood empty for decades, hidden by thick, gnarled trees and surrounded by misty fields. Every November, the townspeople warned newcomers about the November lights, strange, pale glows that flickered in the windows, even though there hadn't been electricity in the house for decades. No one remembered exactly what had happened there, but everyone knew something was wrong with the house. Children spoke of a family that had disappeared one November long ago, leaving their dinner cold on the table, their chairs pulled back as if they'd simply vanished into thin air. People said the house was cursed, that it was a place where the past never faded, where those who entered never truly left. One cold November night, 3 friends, Emily, Nick, and Sarah, dared each other to explore the Weller Place. They'd heard the stories growing up, but they wanted to experience it for themselves, to prove that the stories were just tales meant to scare kids. They laughed as they set off with flashlights and a sense of reckless adventure, brushing off any fear with nervous jokes and loud laughter. The closer they got to the house, the quieter they became. The air grew colder, heavier, as if something unseen was pressing down on them. As they reached the edge of the yard, their flashlights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the overgrown grass and broken fence. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark and empty, like hollow eyes staring into the night. But then, as they moved closer, they saw it, a faint glow in one of the upstairs windows, a soft, pulsing light that looked almost like candlelight. They stopped, exchanging uneasy glances. "Probably just kids messing around," Nick said, but his voice shook. The 3 of them crept forward, their flashlights illuminating the creaking porch. They found the front door ajar, as if inviting them in. They hesitated, but the thrill of the unknown pulled them forward, and they stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust and an underlying metallic smell that made their stomachs turn. The floorboards groaned under their weight, and every sound echoed through the empty rooms, giving the impression that they weren't alone. Their flashlights swept over peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and the remains of an old dining table, still set with plates covered in layers of dust. Then from upstairs, they heard it. A soft, muffled whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. It was the sound of someone talking, or maybe praying. They froze, looking at each other. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. Nick nodded, his face pale. "Maybe we should leave." But Emily, the most skeptical of the 3, shook her head. "It's just the wind. It's just the wind. Let's see if we can find what's making that light." She led them up the stairs, her steps slow and careful, though her face betrayed her nerves. As they reached the 2nd floor, they saw the light again, glowing from the end of the hall. The closer they got, the more the air seemed to hum, thick with energy, as if the house itself were alive and watching them. They reached the room with the light and found the door slightly open, casting a thin line of brightness across the dark hall. Emily pushed the door open and they stepped inside, flashlights aimed at the corners of the room. But there was nothing, just an old, cracked mirror on the wall and the faint scent of smoke lingering in the air. The light had vanished. They heard the whisper again, this time coming from behind them. They spun around, but the hallway was empty. The whisper grew louder, rising into a chorus of voices, each one overlapping with the next, creating a horrible, eerie sound that made their skin crawl. Then they saw it in the mirror. 3 figures stood in the reflection, though they were alone in the room. The figures were pale and thin, with empty eyes and expressions twisted in silent screams. They wore old-fashioned clothes, covered in dirt and blood, as if they'd clawed their way out of the ground. The friends backed away, horrified, but they couldn't look away. The figures seemed to reach out toward them, their hands pressed against the glass, leaving smears of dirt that looked fresh, as if they were trapped just on the other side, desperate to get out. Suddenly, Emily's flashlight flickered and went out. In the darkness, they heard the soft, shuffling sound of footsteps moving closer and the faintest touch of cold fingers brushing against their arms. Panicked, they ran from the room, stumbling down the stairs and out the front door, not daring to look back. But as they reached the yard, they stopped in horror. The house was lit up, every window glowing with a soft, yellow light, and in each window they could see the pale figures staring out, watching them, each face twisted with that same expression of agony and despair. Their mouths moved in silent words, their eyes wide with something that looked like pleading. The friends stumbled backward, their breath coming in gasps, unable to process what they were seeing. Then, as one, the figures raised their hands, pressing them against the glass in unison. And in the silence of the night, the three friends heard a voice, soft and distant, carried by the wind. "Come back, we've been waiting." They turned and ran, not stopping until they reached the edge of town, where the lights and warmth of civilization finally broke the spell that had gripped them. But that night, as they tried to sleep, they each saw the same thing when they closed their eyes. The pale, desperate faces of those trapped souls, still watching, still waiting, calling them back to the house. From that night on, none of them could shake the feeling of being followed. Sometimes, in dark reflections, a car window, a bathroom mirror, they'd catch glimpses of those same figures, watching them from the shadows, reaching out, whispering, calling for them to return. And every November, as the nights grew colder and the fog rolled in, the glow returned to the windows of the Weller place, as if the house remembered them and waited patiently, knowing that sooner or later, they'd come back to join the others. There was an old, winding road called Gray Hollow Pass that cut through the dense woods outside of town. No one took that road if they could avoid it, especially at night. For years, it had a dark reputation. Cars would break down mysteriously, travelers would go missing, and strange noises echoed through the trees. The locals warned newcomers, "If you hear footsteps on Gray Hollow, don't look back. Just keep walking." 3 years ago, a hiker named Sam had ventured onto the road on a cold November evening, ignoring the warnings. He was a skeptic, someone who laughed off superstitions and ghost stories. He was hiking to clear his head, and he figured a solitary walk along Gray Hollow would be the perfect place. The woods were quiet, and he felt that familiar peace of being away from the bustle of town. But as dusk fell, an eerie silence settled around him. The usual chirping of birds and rustling of leaves vanished, replaced by an oppressive stillness. As Sam walked, he felt a strange prickling on the back of his neck, as if he were being watched. He tried to shrug it off, focusing on the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. But then, he heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping like footsteps following him down the road. He paused, turning his head just enough to listen. The sound stopped. He resumed walking, and the footsteps returned, closer this time, matching his pace. A chill ran down his spine as he quickened his stride, refusing to look back. He told himself it was just an echo, just the sound of his own boots against the road. But deep down, he knew. Someone, or something, was following him. The footsteps grew louder, faster, as he tried to walk faster, each step accompanied by a sense of something closing in. The air grew colder, biting against his skin, and he could see his breath clouding in front of him. Shadows began to stretch around him, darker and thicker than seemed possible, as if the very light was being drained from the world. Then he heard a voice, a low, rasping whisper, drifting through the trees. "Sam," it called, stretching his name in a mocking, sing-song tone. He froze, his heart pounding, his breath caught in his throat. He didn't know how it knew his name, but he didn't dare answer. The voice came again, closer, like it was right beside him. "Sam, why don't you look back?" Every nerve in his body screamed at him to keep walking, to ignore it. He took a shaky breath and forced himself to move, step by step, trying to block out the voice. But as he walked, he could feel something cold and heavy settle over him, like invisible hands pressing against his shoulders, weighing him down. Then the voice spoke again, this time more insistent. "Sam, don't you remember? Don't you want to see us?" It felt familiar now, like a distant memory from a dream or a childhood nightmare. The footsteps grew louder, and he could almost feel warm breath against his ear, a sinister, mocking presence pressing in on him. Terrified, he started to run. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out everything but the relentless footsteps that followed, quickening to match his pace. As he ran, the trees blurred past him, and the road seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and winding in impossible directions. Then, up ahead, he saw lights, dim and flickering, like candles. He sprinted toward them, desperate for any sign of escape. But as he drew closer, he realized the lights weren't from houses or cars. They were pale, ghostly lanterns floating in the air, forming a circle on the road. He stumbled to a halt, his breath ragged, staring at the lights in horror. One by one, figures appeared beneath each lantern, faint and translucent, dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothes. They stood motionless, staring at him with empty, hollow eyes. Then he recognized one of them. It was his old friend Mark, who'd gone missing 2 years ago. And next to him was Claire, the girl who'd vanished as a teenager a decade before. Sam's mouth went dry, his mind reeling. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. The figures stepped closer, circling him, their faces blank, yet their eyes full of something unspeakable. One by one, they began whispering, their voices overlapping in a chilling, hypnotic murmur. "You were supposed to stay. We've been waiting." As they spoke, Sam felt his strength drain, as if his very life was being pulled from him. His legs felt weak, his vision blurring as the cold seeped deeper into his bones. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body was paralyzed. One figure stepped forward, close enough for him to see its face clearly. It was hollow and sunken, its mouth stretching into an unnatural smile. "Join us, Sam. It's your turn." He stumbled back, breaking free from the trance, and turned to run. But the road twisted and shifted, the trees closing in around him, blocking his path. The ghostly figures moved closer, reaching out with cold, bony hands, their whispers rising to a feverish chant. "You can't leave, Sam. No one ever leaves." In a final act of desperation, he closed his eyes, clamping his hands over his ears, and shouted, "Leave me alone." The silence that followed was absolute. He opened his eyes slowly, finding himself alone in the middle of the road, the lanterns and figures gone. The forest was dark and silent once more. Without another thought, he sprinted back the way he'd come, not stopping until he reached his car at the edge of the woods. Breathless and shaking, he climbed inside and sped away, refusing to look back at Grey Hollow Pass. Sam never spoke about that night, but he wasn't the same after. He left town a few months later, cutting off contact with everyone, becoming a ghost himself. But every November, the locals say you can hear footsteps on Grey Hollow Pass, the steady echoing sound of someone walking in circles. And if you listen closely, you might even hear the faint, haunting whispers calling for Sam, waiting for him to come back, or calling for someone new to join them on that endless, haunted road. On the edge of town, hidden by thick woods and overgrown ivy, there was an old cemetery known as Ravenswood. It was the kind of place no one dared visit at night, especially in November when the mist crept in from the marshes and covered the ground like a shroud. The townsfolk spoke of strange figures seen between the trees, but the most disturbing story was of the gravedigger's lantern. The story went that every November on the darkest nights, a faint light would appear in the cemetery, a single lantern swaying through the mist, casting long, eerie shadows. The townsfolk believed the light belonged to a gravedigger who'd gone mad decades ago. He'd worked himself to death, digging graves every night until his lantern finally burned out. But on the anniversary of his death, the lantern was said to reappear, guiding him as he continued his work. And they said that anyone who crossed his path would be dragged into the earth, buried alive to join the souls he'd been digging for. One cold November night, a group of college friends, Tom, Jenna, and Lisa, decided to test the legend. They'd all grown up in town and had heard the story countless times, but they wanted to prove that the lantern was just a spooky story, nothing more. Armed with flashlights and nervous laughter, they slipped past the cemetery's rusted iron gates, crunching over dead leaves and loose gravel. The air inside Ravenswood was different, colder and still, as if the place itself were holding its breath. Fog clung to the ground, swirling around their feet, and their flashlights barely cut through the thick darkness. They walked deeper, passing headstones and crumbling mausoleums, the silence around them absolute. After a while, they stopped, their breaths visible in the cold air. "Nothing here," Tom muttered, trying to hide his relief. But then Jenna froze, pointing through the mist. "Look!" In the distance, a faint glow was bobbing between the trees, moving slowly like someone carrying a lantern. The three friends went silent, staring as the light grew brighter, drawing closer. It was exactly as the stories had described, a single pale lantern swinging in the dark. Tom chuckled nervously. Probably some prank, someone else trying to scare us. But as the lantern moved closer, they saw there was no figure holding it. It seemed to float on its own, weaving between headstones, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and crawl along the ground. The light moved steadily toward them, unhurried yet inevitable, as if it knew exactly where they were. Jenna took a step back, her voice shaking. "We should go. Now." But before they could move, the light stopped, hovering in place as though watching them. The fog thickened around them, the air growing colder, pressing down on them. And then they heard it, a faint scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the ground. The three friends turned to run, but the fog had thickened, swirling around them in a strange, unnatural way, disorienting them. No matter which direction they turned, the gravestones seemed to shift and rearrange as if the cemetery itself were changing to keep them there. The lantern began to move again, gliding slowly through the fog, getting closer with each second. The scraping sound grew louder, closer, like something was digging just beneath their feet. "Run!" Jenna screamed, pulling Lisa with her as they stumbled through the dense mist. Tom was right behind them, but as they ran, he tripped, falling hard against a headstone. His flashlight skittered away, its beam cutting a narrow path through the fog. He struggled to his feet, glancing back, and froze. The lantern was right there, only a few feet away, casting an eerie, flickering light over the headstones. And in its glow, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A hand, pale and bony, reaching up from the earth. The fingers curled, clawing at the ground as if something was trying to pull itself out of the grave. Panicked, he stumbled backward, calling out for Jenna and Lisa, but his voice seemed swallowed by the fog. He scrambled to his feet, desperate to escape, but the ground beneath him felt soft and loose, as though the soil itself were giving way. Meanwhile, Jenna and Lisa had stopped, realizing Tom wasn't behind them. They called his name, their voices echoing through the fog. But all they heard in response was the faint, rhythmic scrape of something digging, closer and closer. They turned back, flashlights sweeping through the darkness, and spotted the glow of the lantern. It was hovering over an open grave, casting long shadows over a figure lying halfway in the earth. It was Tom. They ran to him, panic rising as they tried to pull him free, but he was stuck, his legs seemingly trapped by invisible hands dragging him down. His eyes were wide, terrified, his hands clawing at the ground as he tried to pull himself out. "Help me," he gasped, his voice breaking with fear. But no matter how hard they pulled, he continued to sink, the earth swallowing him inch by inch. And then, as they struggled, they felt it. A cold, bony hand reaching out from beneath the soil, wrapping around their ankles, pulling them down too. The lantern's glow intensified, casting a harsh light over them as more hands emerged from the earth, skeletal fingers curling around their wrists, their legs dragging them down into the waiting grave. The digging sound grew louder, faster, until it was a frenzy, as if hundreds of hands were clawing through the dirt, eager to pull them down. They screamed, struggling against the relentless pull, but it was no use. The ground seemed to open up beneath them, yawning like a hungry mouth, swallowing them inch by inch until the earth closed over their heads, their screams muffled by the soil. The cemetery grew silent once more, the fog settling over the ground like a shroud. The lantern flickered one last time, casting a brief, ghostly glow over the freshly turned earth. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the lantern winked out, leaving nothing but darkness and silence. The next morning, the groundskeeper found 3 sets of footprints leading into the cemetery, but none leading out. In the place where they had disappeared, there was a single, fresh grave. The soil turned as if someone had been digging there all night. No one ever saw Tom, Jenna, or Lisa again. But every November, on the darkest nights, the townsfolk say you can see the lantern of the old gravedigger swaying through the mist, and if you listen closely, you can hear the soft sound of digging growing louder as the cemetery waits for its next visitors to join the lost souls beneath Ravenswood. A narrow, winding road called Devil's Ridge snaked through the hills on the edge of town, lined by ancient trees whose branches seemed to reach out like bony fingers. The road had a sinister history. Decades ago, there had been a terrible accident there, a school bus that veered off the edge on a dark November night. Some said the road was cursed, that the bus had been haunted, and that it was still driving the ridge, looking for someone to join its last ride. The legend claimed that on certain foggy nights in November, a lone traveler might hear the creak of bus wheels and the faint sound of children's laughter echoing in the distance. And if you looked closely, you might catch a glimpse of headlights through the mist growing brighter as the bus approached. It was said that if you saw the bus, you had two choices: look away and keep walking, or get on board and never come back. One bitterly cold November evening, a man named Eric found himself stranded on Devil's Ridge. His car had broken down miles back and his cell phone had no signal. He'd heard the stories about the ridge but dismissed them as nonsense. With nothing but his flashlight, he set off along the road, his breath visible in the cold air. The night was eerily silent, with only the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. As he walked, the mist thickened, swirling around him, obscuring his view of the road ahead. He tried to quicken his pace, eager to reach the main road, but the fog grew denser, suffocating. His flashlight began to flicker, casting weak beams of light that barely cut through the gloom. Then he heard it, a faint, metallic creak from somewhere behind him, the unmistakable sound of wheels rolling slowly over gravel. He stopped, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling, and turned to peer into the fog. There was nothing, just the mist swirling in the darkness. He shook his head, dismissing it as his imagination, and kept walking, his pace quickening. But a few minutes later, the sound returned, louder this time, the steady, rhythmic creak of a bus rolling down the road. And beneath it, he heard something else, a chilling sound that made his blood run cold, the soft, distant laughter of children. He froze, gripping his flashlight tightly. His instincts told him to run, but something stronger, a morbid curiosity or a misplaced sense of bravery, kept him rooted to the spot. He turned around slowly, squinting into the fog, straining to see through the thick mist. The headlights appeared first, two dim orbs of light that grew brighter as they drew closer. Then the shape of an old-school bus materialized. The paint faded and peeling, the windows cracked and fogged. The bus came to a stop a few feet from him, its headlights casting an unnatural, ghostly glow over the road. Eric's heart hammered in his chest, and every fiber of his being screamed for him to turn and run. But then the door creaked open with a hiss, and he caught a glimpse of the driver, a gaunt, pale figure wearing a threadbare uniform, his hollow eyes fixed on Eric with an intense, unblinking stare. And behind the driver, peering out from the dimly lit seats, were the faces of children. Their expressions were vacant, their eyes dark and empty, yet their lips were stretched into unsettling smiles. They were too still, their faces frozen, as if carved from stone. The driver raised a skeletal hand, beckoning Eric to step aboard. A chill ran down Eric's spine, but he couldn't move, trapped by the driver's gaze. Somewhere in the depths of his mind, he heard a voice, soft, hypnotic, coaxing him forward. "It's cold out there. Come on in. You're safe here." The words seemed to wrap around him like a fog, seeping into his mind and dulling his fear. Almost against his will, he took a step forward, his feet moving as though controlled by invisible strings. He placed one foot on the bus's first step, and in that moment the laughter returned, louder this time, echoing through the empty seats. The children's faces grew sharper, their smiles stretching wider until they looked like rictus grins, hollow and hungry. Their hands reached out, thin and pale, fingers curling in his direction. A jolt of fear snapped him out of the trance. He staggered back, stumbling down the steps and out of the bus, the fog swallowing him as he broke free from the driver's gaze. The door of the bus closed with a loud hiss, and for a moment he thought he saw a flash of disappointment in the driver's hollow eyes. But as he backed away, the headlights grew dim again, the bus slowly rolling forward, disappearing into the mist as if it had never been there. He stood in the road, heart pounding, watching the fog swallow the bus whole. The laughter faded, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the quiet of the night. He took a shaky breath and turned back toward town, not daring to look behind him. The walk felt endless, each step heavy with the memory of those vacant eyes and frozen smiles. When he finally reached his car, his hands trembled as he started the engine and drove home, the events of the night replaying in his mind. He never spoke of what he'd seen, fearing no one would believe him. But every November, on foggy nights, he thought of the bus, still rolling through the mist, carrying its ghostly passengers down Devil's Ridge, waiting patiently for the next unfortunate soul to join them on their endless ride. And sometimes, in the dead of night, he could swear he heard it. The faint, distant laughter of children drifting through the fog, calling him back to the ridge for one final journey. In the heart of the cold November woods, there was a path known as the Whisper Trail, a name earned from the legend that claimed anyone who walked it could hear soft whispers coming from the trees. The legend said the whispers were voices of those who had vanished there, people who had wandered onto the path and never returned. The whispers were said to be warnings, but it was also rumored that anyone who stopped to listen too closely would be lost forever. Samira and her boyfriend Derek had heard about Whisper Trail for years, but never took the stories seriously. They'd grown up in the area, and ghost stories were a dime a dozen. So, one evening, armed with flashlights and a determination to debunk the tale, they ventured into the woods, their breath fogging in the freezing air. The path was narrow, flanked by towering skeletal trees whose bare branches formed twisted shadows against the dim light. It wasn't long before they heard it. Faint murmurs drifting through the trees. At first they were too quiet to make out, like wind passing through the branches. Samira laughed nervously, glancing at Derek, who just shrugged. "Probably the wind," he said, though his voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. But as they walked deeper, the whispers grew louder and more distinct. They sounded like voices, soft, pleading, like someone murmuring just beyond the edge of the flashlight's beam. Samira paused, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. She thought she heard her name, but when she turned to Derek, his face was tight with concentration, his eyes scanning the trees. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, but it's probably just echoing," he replied, though he didn't look convinced. They kept walking, but the voices followed, rising and falling in an eerie, rhythmic murmur. Every so often, they'd catch a few distinct words. "Help me. Lost. Come back." It felt as if the voices were coming from all directions, and yet when they shone their flashlights toward the source, there was nothing but empty woods. After another minute, Derek stopped dead in his tracks, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" Samira strained her ears, and this time the voice was unmistakable. It was a soft, pleading cry whispering, "Derek!" drawing out his name in a way that made her blood run cold. She grabbed his hand, pulling him forward. "Let's just go. This is ridiculous." But Derek didn't move. He was staring into the trees, his eyes fixed on something in the shadows. Samira followed his gaze and saw what looked like a figure standing just off the path. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but it looked like a person. No, like a shadow of a person, its form wavering as though it were part of the mist. "Derek," Samira whispered urgently, tugging his arm, but he didn't respond. His eyes were wide and his body seemed rooted to the spot like he was in a trance. Then, to her horror, the figure raised an arm and beckoned, the motion slow and unnatural. As it did, she heard the whispers intensify, all the voices melding together into one word, repeated over and over. "Come! Come! Come!" Panic gripped her, and she pulled on Derek with all her strength. Finally, he snapped out of it, stumbling back, his face ashen. Without a word, they turned and ran back down the trail, the voices chasing them, growing louder, angrier. As they ran, the whispers turned into shouts, fragmented voices crying out, almost screaming. Samira glanced back, her flashlight beam catching flashes of movement, glimpses of faces in the darkness, twisted in silent pleas and anguish. When they finally reached the trailhead, the voices stopped. They doubled over, gasping for breath, the only sound their own ragged breathing. The woods around them were silent, as though nothing had happened, as though they'd imagined it all. But then Samira looked at Derek and saw something that made her stomach twist. There, clinging to his jacket, was a handprint, a dark, muddy stain shaped like fingers, pressed into the fabric. Derek's eyes widened as he noticed it too, and he frantically tried to wipe it away, but it wouldn't budge, as though it were burned into the cloth. They hurried back to town, silent, shaken. That night, Samira tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching her, listening to her every breath. The next morning, she called Derek, but he didn't answer. When she went to his house, his mother said he'd gone out early, saying something about needing to find something. He hadn't come back. Panicked, Samira retraced their steps, returning to Whisper Trail despite the dread pooling in her stomach. She walked the length of the path, calling Derek's name, but the woods remained silent. As she neared the spot where they'd seen the figure, she found something that made her heart freeze. There, lying in the dirt, was Derek's flashlight, its bulb broken, the handle covered in the same muddy, hand-shaped stains. The townsfolk searched the woods for days, but Derek was never found. Some said he must have wandered off the trail, lost in the dense woods. Others whispered he had been taken by the spirits of Whisper Trail, claimed by the voices he'd ignored. In the months that followed, Samira couldn't shake the feeling that something from the trail had followed her. She'd hear faint whispers at night, soft voices that sounded so much like Derek's, calling her name, begging her to return. Finally, one cold November evening, she couldn't bear it any longer. Driven by an urge she couldn't explain, she returned to the trail, her flashlight cutting through the mist as she walked deep into the woods, stopping where she'd last seen Derek. The whispering began almost immediately, soft at first, then rising to a haunting crescendo. She stood still, letting the voices wash over her, feeling them echo in her mind. She knew she should leave, that she'd end up like Derek if she stayed. But then, from deep in the woods, she heard it, a faint voice, familiar, pleading. Samira. It was Derek, or at least it sounded like him. She took a step forward, her heart pounding, and as she did, she felt something cold like a hand pressed gently against her shoulder, guiding her deeper into the woods. The last anyone saw of her was a single beam of light vanishing into the mist. The search parties found nothing, not even footprints, as if she'd simply disappeared. To this day, if you walk down Whisper Trail in November, you might hear soft murmurs drifting through the trees, voices calling out names, pleading for help. And if you listen closely enough, they say you can hear two voices among them, a young man and a woman, forever wandering the trail, searching for each other in the fog.